Okay. Greetings in the love and light of the infinite creator. I'm Andrii Zvorygin, joined here today with Roger Bentley, Dan, Bob, and Jordan. And Simon Michaux will be joining us when he's ready. But for now, I'm going to do a presentation on deep geothermal. And then Dan has stuff on geothermal, hydrogen hubs, which will dovetail right into it. Okay. And so let's begin. And so we have the Eavor loops. And then what's interesting about why deep geothermal, sustainable, always on energy source, stable 24/7. It's a reliable base load, unlike solar or wind. It's got a small surface footprint. So it's great for urban, rural, or agricultural land use in terms of that you're not using up a large amount of agricultural rural land with solar panels. Instead, you are using just like a few acres will give you enough heat and electricity for a town of, say, 4,000 or 5,000 people or neighborhood. So century scale, and once you have it set up with a closed loop system, it has 100 to 200 year lifespan. And it's a fully sealed system. There's no fracking, no leaks, no aquifer, and you can have energy independence. And so it's actually, even if it cools down, it'll heat back up again. And so here we're just looking at the global geothermal access roadmap. There's the gradient map. We'll get to that in a bit. And so right now, see, in the 1980s, since the 1980s, we can do 2 to 3 kilometers, and that includes EGS, where we're like fracking and open wells, and there's a wide diversity of technologies at this shallow level. And so there's the California geysers and Nevada, Iceland, Kenya Rift. Like there's certain areas where you can do that. They have a very high geothermal gradient, and then. So, for example, the areas in red here, they have a high geothermal gradient. And then you have the high heat flow basins. And so that is where we're currently at. And so Eavor Deep and Germany closed loop are, so over here, if you see in the green, so that's the 45 degree 30 to 45 Celsius per kilometer square. So now, when we have this Eavor Deep, it will, which is in progress, it will most likely succeed, and then we'll have it proven. And then for deeper ones, we're gonna have to wait. Like based on the current trajectory of estimates, so we'll probably get to 6 kilometers by early 2030s. 7 kilometers by the mid 2030s, and then by 2040 we should get to 8 kilometers. This one's a little bit outdated. Here, I'll see if I can refresh that. No, okay. Anyhow, and so yeah, we'll get back to that map in a bit. And so why EGS fails below 4 kilometers? So one of the things that I've been talking over the last couple of months to various, for example, the Station 1 deep heat in Finland. So it was 6.5 kilometers deep, and it failed because it was like without proppant. We don't have any proppant that can exceed 100 megapascals. And that happens at a depths about 3.5 to 4 kilometers. And so, and below those things, below those depths, the granite or whatever, it becomes soft and it starts to deform. And so here's the example. St. Deep 1 wasn't the first one, Station 1. And so it was in the 2016 to 2023, and it was 6.4 kilometers. Then there was Basel EGS in Switzerland. It also had problems with fractures and seismic risk because basically they have to have repeated fracking in order to keep the loops open. So they've had this one in France at 5.1 kilometers. And so,
Andrew,
yeah,
Andrew,
go ahead.
all this points out is they keep depressurizing these things, and the rock seals in. When you drill past 10 kilometers, the rock becomes plastic. It seals up even a drill hole.
Well, yeah.
So why don't they just keep it pressurized? That's what's annoying about this whole thing.
Yeah. Well, if you can reach out to them and ask them,
I mean, in horizontal drilling or fracking, they depressurize after they frack it because oil and gas are coming out, and of course they open up the cracks with sand and stuff like that. But the point of Raft River is they never depressurized it. All the wells were pressurized.
Right. And so here we have Raft River, at least on the publicly available information, is at 2 kilometers. And so it's fine because proppant works in Raft River because it's below that 3.5 to 4 kilometer depth. And you see, you've got like in Iceland, all of the green ones are commercial successes or, commercial pilots, whatever. And then... so these ones are working, and then the yellow ones are in progress, and then the blue were a scientific success. Unfortunately, didn't have enough colors, so you can't tell them apart here. But basically, scientific success means that they learned something. It doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. But Eavor Deep in New Mexico, for example.
Yeah, Andrew, who's come up with this time scale when these certain things are going to be achieved? I mean,
so in terms of the time scale here in the 6 kilometers.
I mean, like for example, they got 6 or 7. We're going to achieve it by this date. I mean, who's setting that date?
So I did a linear regression or polynomial regression based on the existing commercial successes, and then just projected it out. And this is a more optimistic one, actually. The current numbers I have, we'll actually get to 8 kilometers by 2050. I can see if I can get the more recent one.
I'm saying, did you come up with this chart, or did you?
Yes,
come up
yes.
With it,
So I made this chart based on the existing data that is available online. And then I used computer programs to run a polynomial projection. And so basically,
at their current rate, here's where they should be.
Yes, exactly. At the current rate, that's where we'll go. I mean, this is all subject to how much investment and, geopolitical turmoil or lack thereof, stability that we have. And so the timeline can move faster or slower. But yeah, like I said, this unfortunately, I didn't double check the graphic, but my newer graphic will get to 8 kilometers by 2050. And then so for the majority of the Earth over here, if we look at this graph, so 65 to 70% we'll get by 8 kilometers. We'll get to 10 kilometers by 2050. And so, but for most of the Earth, 7 to 8 kilometers will be enough. And then that will be by about 2040 at current rates. So yeah, thanks for your questions. And then so yeah, these are the EGS. So the closed loop systems are the solution. There's no fracking, no proppant, no fluid loss, and they can operate reliably beyond 6 to 8 kilometers. Eavor Deep in New Mexico proved the tech at 5.5 kilometers at 250 Celsius, but they didn't add. It wasn't a full loop that they made here. It was they just kind of drilled the hole and they did the horizontal drilling, and they managed to accomplish this 5.5 kilometer deep at within 4 months. And so they've got the drilling tech down pretty good. And so how it works is they have a closed loop U-tube, 2 verticals joined by multilateral horizontals, and the natural siphon, and it's a natural thermosiphon. So with the EGS, you need to have high pressure pumps, and that's a big energy take. But these ones, they work without any energy inputs. They're just a natural thermosiphon, and so you see like water like cools down, and then it goes down, and then it heats up inside, and then it goes up. And this was done in 2019. and this is kind of the minimum viable product idea they had. And I think they're doing either one or two in Germany right now, and it's supposed to come online sometime between this year and next. And so we'll have to see how that pans out. But anyways, here's a comparison of deep drilling technologies for geothermal. The conventional rotary mud, it is a mature technology, and I think Dan has experience with that. But it requires heavy casing, and it's slow significantly. I believe this is what they were using for the Finnish one, the deep heat, and so it was very slow. But the Eavor enhanced tech is much faster because they managed to do the 5.5 kilometers within 4 months. But we'll see how it turns out in Germany. And then there's the casing materials. So we have a variety of casing materials. There's the carbon steel. This one is usually used for oil and gas. However, it's not. It only has a very short longevity, and then it can only really go to 4 kilometers here. So, but we do have some that can do, say in Ontario, we would need 7 to 8.5 kilometers, and that's like bimetallic carbon. So you have the carbon steel on the outside and then stainless steel on the inside, and then that will give you 100 to 200 plus years of a closed loop system at up to 250 to 600 Celsius. So that is very, very good. And then, well, you can see the price points there. It is like 10 times more than what we use right now for regular extracting of steel, but because the life expectancy is much higher, it becomes worth it. And so you can notice there's certain hotspots here, and so that's kind of interesting, and that what dovetails with the geothermal. The hydrogen, because the hotspots can export hydrogen, like Sardinia can supply energy to a lot of Europe. And then like there's France and Turkey, and then also Saudi Arabia. Once they run out of oil, they have their Tanakh region over here, Tabuk, which is huge. It is like 1,600 kilometers, and there's Sardinia. Square kilometers, 1,600 square kilometers. So they can produce many millions of barrels equivalent of hydrogen there, and the Red Sea area, and then you've got hotspots in the U.S. and China and things like that. So the major players have, will be part of the hydrogen economy. Okay, and then I noticed Simon Michaux has joined us. Hello, Simon.
Hi guys, how you doing?
Hey, good. And yeah, you got your so Simon is going to be. Are you presenting on China today?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and I know Dan just has one that dovetails with the geothermal one that I just did. I don't know. Is it very long, Dan?
No. It's only what 5 or 6 slides, and I think actually only 4 of them are actually on the report.
Okay,
4 or 5 of them. Yeah.
So maybe we can let Dan go, and then you, Simon.
Sure, not a problem.
Okay, Dan. Do you know how to share screen?
Yeah, I'm going to do it right now. So.
Okay, go ahead. And then I know we have Steve as well.
Okay, can you see the screen?
Hold on, I'm just seeing black right now. Oh, okay, and now I'm seeing a volcano.
Okay.
Yes, I'm seeing your home screen. So this is good. You shared the whole screen.
Okay.
If you go into presentation mode, yes. Okay, I see Electrum Power Tech. Good.
Okay. So just the spiel for the company, right? And of course, obviously, this is just of educational purposes only. So nobody scream at me for using their intellectual property. I'm just using it for educational purposes only. A number of the hydrogen hubs around the United States have been suspended indefinitely. Interesting, most of these hubs are centered around the oil refiners in the United States. The IRS released the hydrogen taxing rules 1 week before Donald Trump became president of the United States. One of the first things that President Trump did is he basically suspended the activity of those hydrogen tax credits. The oil and gas. You see the next slide?
Yes.
Okay. The oil and gas industry claims green hydrogen production from wind and solar is too expensive. I guess nobody told them about all the wind and solar power that's curtailed in the United States. Trillions of watts of waste electricity. Hydrogen could be produced for the cost of the equipment. I think I showed you guys this chart before. SPP and MISO, that's the computer system that is designed for controlling the power grid. We curtail an average 800 megawatts of wind power per hour. Times 24 hours times 365, that's over 7 terawatts per year. The state of Texas curtails on average 16 terawatts of wind every year. The wind's blowing, but we're not using the power.
Mm-hmm.
So the point being is the oil and gas industry, they claim that producing hydrogen with electricity is too expensive, right? But obviously that can't be true with just the amount of electric power that's being wasted right now.
Mm-hmm. And so curtail, what does that mean exactly?
When you curtail a wind farm, when they curtail power, when basically we have more power than we need in the power grid, what they do is they'll usually have a number. When you go to a wind farm, you'll see some of the turbines where they applied the brakes and the blades aren't moving. But you have at least one or two wind turbines, the blades are actually turning. And what they do is they measure how many megawatts that wind turbine's producing, and then they multiply it by the number of the turbines where they've applied brakes where the blades aren't moving. That tells you how much wind power that's just not being used, not being extracted.
Mm-hmm.
Because one turbine's running, we're measuring the power that it's producing, multiply that by the number of ones we applied the brakes on that aren't moving. And that's how we measure how much energy we're curtailing.
So you're suggesting instead of turning off turbines, they can keep them on and then just be producing hydrogen with that extra energy?
Well, what the idea here, and this goes back to grid management, managing the power grid. What I propose is that right now we have a system where we manage the generation versus the consumption. We always try to keep the generation consumption pretty close bind to each other. What I'm saying is allow the wind turbines to run, allow all the extra energy to be consumed by the electrolysis out in the power grid. And by using the system that I designed, you can dynamically turn the electrolyzers off. As an example, in this part of the United States, we don't use natural gas for making cement. We use a carbon arc, electric arc to make cement. A lot of the companies that make cement, they have them on a schedule where we basically turn their power off when there's a lot of load on the grid and everybody's using their air conditioning. So we, for example, ICI is a company here in Indiana that makes cement. We turn their ability to make cement off while the power grid's being overloaded. But whenever use on the grid is low, we allow them to make cement with that extra power. In return, the company, they get a really cut rate, a really cheap cost for making electricity that they use for making cement. So what I'm talking about isn't anything weird or strange. It's just managing the power grid in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Okay. But anyway, the truth is a BP Whiting refinery, which is up there up there near Chicago. It's in the northwest corner of Indiana. The truth is a BP refinery in Indiana's hydrogen hub was suspended indefinitely due to the real purpose being suspended or delayed in construction. The United States, originally they actually built that hub so they could feed CO2 into the continental CO2 pipeline system. In addition, the price of natural gas in the United States cannot be predicted for any time period beyond 10 years from this point. So what it means is they can't guarantee that natural gas is going to be inexpensive to be using this in this hydrogen hub. Natural gas is no longer a flare gas. It is now priced on an international basis.
So are these CO2 pipelines that we're looking at here?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. A number of these pipelines have either been canceled or delayed, right, in construction because of that. BP indefinitely suspended their hydrogen hub because they were going to use steam reforming of natural gas to produce the hydrogen. What everybody misses about this is that steam reforming, it allows them to chemically separate out the CO2. Its original purpose was really, what they're not telling you, was to feed the CO2 system. Since the CO2 pipeline system is not being built through northern Indiana, they suspended the hydrogen hub. They were also having a hard time gathering contracts that are 10 years or longer out for natural gas within reasonable amounts. So whenever they tried to go out there and buy contracts for purchasing natural gas going out 10 years, a lot of the prices they were getting were between $15 and $20 per million BTUs. To give you context, right now natural gas is between $3 and $4 per million BTUs. In Japan, they're paying $14 per million BTUs for LNG, liquefied natural gas. At the Dutch TTF in Europe, they're paying close to $14 per million BTUs. So they were getting contract prices back that were in excess of what we're currently paying for LNG. So what that means is that the energy industry 10 years from now, they're expecting energy prices for natural gas to go up. So that's what I'm saying. This is no longer a flare gas. It's no longer a gas you can just throw away. It now has a price on it. It is now an international commodity. The other issue that BP had is that they weren't able to find enough companies that could provide H2 franchise filling stations. Royal Dutch Shell apparently is getting out of that business. For example, if you've been in a service station in California for hydrogen, those are usually Shell stations. And of course, a number of the military providers like Millennium Marine Energy, apparently they're too small for BP to do business with, which is rather disappointing for me because I usually rely upon Chris Whitney and Millennium Marine Energy for service stations for a lot of equipment. Okay.
All right.
Next one. There are data centers for AI.
Are we still? Oh, okay. I see.
There you go.
Okay, there's the new one. Okay.
Yeah, big oil is one point. Yeah, carbon capture. Okay. So there are data centers for AI springing up all over the United States. The oil and gas industry is building gas turbine power plants right next to data centers to clean up their emissions. They're offering to sell carbon capture. In other words, they're having high technology companies pay for carbon capture, for which the oil and gas companies are going to feed into the CO2 system for an enhanced oil field services recovery. So it's kind of it's basically they're saying we'll help you clean up the environment, make the technology companies pay for it to power their data centers, but at the same time they've got the CO2 they can feed into this continental CO2 pipeline system for an enhanced oil field service recovery. So I think it's kind of a twist on reality. What's actually going on. Questions? Okay, go to the next one. You see the next one?
Okay. Yes, this is liquefied CO2. Yeah. These are the existing pipelines?
Yeah, the existing pipelines. So last year, Exxon acquired carbon capture utility service specialist Danbury Incorporated. Danbury recycles CO2 through its enhanced oil recovery operations and uses it to produce environmentally friendly carbon negative blue oil. So they've already got a new name for this oil they're going to capture through enhanced oil field recovery CO2. They call it blue oil. Apparently, what's going on with the Big Beautiful Bill? Apparently, in the Big Beautiful Bill, originally they were going to have the hydrogen tax credits end January 1st of 2026. Apparently, that's been extended out to 2028. But apparently, the oil and gas industry was able to basically seal in stone their carbon capture tax credits so they can keep going on with their plans. So basically, hydrogen has out to 2028, then our tax credits go away. But at the same time, the oil and gas companies still have what they need to make their carbon capture system, continue going. So it's kind of a twist on the whole thing. And that's about all I got.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. And so, I just wanted to add that, I just quickly did some calculations over here. Simon's coming next, and he's getting his slides ready. The total cost of ownership for deep geothermal to green hydrogen would yield a barrel oil equivalent of about $150 to $200 per barrel.
Yeah, if you listen to the oil and gas industry, that's true.
Yeah,
if you listen to them,
that's at a high gradient zone, and a low gradient zone.
Again, it goes back to the story they're telling. Like I said, because they got this fantasy out there that you can do stream reforming, right? Then that's cheaper than electrolysis. And what they're basing it on is at one time this was flare gas. This was flat gas they were getting away. It was free. It's no longer free. And therefore, that's why they've been shutting down these hydrogen hubs, because they can't get a contract for natural gas going past 10 years. And the reason why is because they're starting to calculate in the decline rates of all the oil fields.
Right. Yeah. And then Roger was here with us. And then one of the things is that if they do update the information, then I think that will...
Well, understand, remember, I'm a utility guy. I'm not an oil and gas guy. So what they're feeding you is crap. I'm a power guy. I know what the cost of electricity is, what the cost of electrolysis is. I've just showed you all the trillions of watts they're curtailing of electric power that we can make hydrogen for nothing. And it's in millions of tons.
From those curtailed sources, it could be good. Yeah, but
Yeah.
I'll just show for our audience here. This is what ChatGPT 03, the latest model, calculated out in the Tabuk region. Per kilo, it's $3 to $4. So
I'm saying that was with those hydrogen hubs using steam reforming, but they've shut them all down. That's what I'm saying. That information is dated and irrelevant. They've already shut down the hubs. That's originally what they sold it on, was that steam reforming and making hydrogen. Those were the prices that they were quoting. But the problem they have is when somebody like me shows up with data from the power grid that blows this out of the water.
Yeah, and then the CO2 oil is a much lower EROI, but if you use the EROI of electricity, it becomes worthwhile at a local level.
Well, think about what they're doing. What they're doing is they're having the high-tech companies with the AI data centers pay for the carbon capture. That's what they're doing. They're charging them to pay for it, and on top of that, they get the tax credits, so they don't pay any taxes for producing this oil.
All right, Simon, you ready? Oh, you're muted.
I was going to say, is the sound okay?
Yeah. Well, now it's good.
Okay. All right. So let me share. Screen window. Okay. Okay. Can you see that?
Yes. China Go defeats chess.
Okay.
This is the window, not the screen. Just
the window, not the screen. Okay. So
well, yeah. I don't think it will maximize if it's just.
Is it not in the full screen presentation?
No, I don't see the full screen presentation. I just see the window of the presentation.
Right. Hang on.
Okay.
So let's try that again. Hang on. So I'm just trying to get it to share entire screen. Share. And now if I do that, what about now? Is that?
Yes, I think so. Try going to the next slide.
Okay, so the next slide.
Yes, good. It works. It works.
Right. Right, boys and girls. So this is an analysis I did recently to look at the industrial footprint of China, and I found something that I didn't quite expect, and it has some relatively serious implications, and it actually talks to everything that we discuss on this channel. You might notice my affiliation is Third Rock from the Sun. I'm actually preparing for to start doing stuff in a personal context.
Okay.
And so I'm like, I want to be working on my Prometheus project, and I've got written permission from my employer to do that, but they've asked me to keep affiliations all personal. Anyway,
okay.
So this is actually my old consulting card slide. So I used to be a consultant 10 years ago. All right. So the mandate I'm operating at the moment is to map out each of the major economies and their industrial capabilities in the big picture. This is mineral intelligence. And so you got the big picture, but then you've got the enormous picture. Go up to orbit, look down, look what's really happening. All right. So based on that, what is the Chinese footprint? Now, China is on everyone's fingertips. Everyone's asking about about this, and everyone wants to know. 10 years ago, it was almost taboo to actually ask about what China was doing, but now people get it.
Yeah.
So what I've come to the conclusion is there's this basic thing that goes through this whole presentation. We are looking at the wrong things. So what I did was I went back to fundamentals and asked, what are we doing? And where are our ideas actually coming from? And why? What do we think we're doing? And what I'm sort of finding is everyone around me does this in a professional sense where they just follow what everyone else has done. They follow the same critical raw materials lists. They use the same two basic formulas of economics, economic importance and supply scarcity, both of which I think are not valid. So starting again from the bottom. So the question is this: is there a Chinese plan for the extraction of resources and industrial manufacture? Europe's got one. We call it the circular economy. What are the international implications? And what does it mean for us? And is that resource plan part of something else? Now, usually we are asked to look at something, for example, how much material was mined in a particular country, like Canada, for example, for a particular year. And that's the extent of people sort of asking what's actually happening. They're also now starting to track the value chain, but they'll do it in specific circumstances. They won't do it as like a standard thing across all sectors. So what I've come to the conclusion is this. In the West, our paradigm, I started in industrial, but I'm going to go geopolitical here, and there's a reason for that.
Mm-hmm.
The Western paradigm is like chess, where we take out the enemy king. And the Chinese paradigm is like the game of Go.
Yes.
Where they take over territory over time. And it's two very different paradigms.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I often tell this to people.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Okay. So it's not, and but you could say that the Western paradigm has ruled the planet for the last 400 or 500 years,
Mm-hmm.
or however long. Whereas the Chinese culture is thousands of years old, and they were dominant thousands of years ago. They want that dominance back.
Mm-hmm.
So then the question becomes, well, what about the rest of the BRICS? And India, Russia, Japan, South Korea. Like, they're not Western, and they will have a strategy different to the Chinese. So at the back of everyone's mind, this is what, back of my mind at least, when I was doing this analysis, this is what I was also thinking. I'm talking about China today, but only China.
Mm-hmm.
So China controls the majority of the industrial system. Now, people say that, but I've actually not seen people actually present any data on that. I've got some data. So hold on to your hat. So what's their plan, and do they have one? See, even do they have one, the people were reluctant to acknowledge that. Yes, they have one. We'll discuss it shortly. Have we misunderstood what is happening? Yes. Are we looking at the wrong things? Yes. And what might we do about it? Right. My approach was this. I started out when I was working in the mining industry in feasibility studies. We had this thing with the operational theory of constraints, and what was the fastest, what was the bottleneck to making more money? And we would look at the whole system, and we would optimize the system to find out where the operational bottleneck was.
Mm-hmm.
But the goal was to make money. So I've taken that basic idea, but then taken the word money out, and then asked, well, what are we really wanting to know? Well, in this world that we're looking at, is it just money anymore? The answer is no. Actually, no. We actually we want resilience, and we actually want, in this case, the raw materials themselves, metals in particular, but the control point is actually manufactured goods. So what's the real bottleneck and the rate determining step? And the answer to that question, I believe, is smelting and refining of precursor materials, but more on that later. So what are the true vulnerabilities? Then there is the idea of industrial ecology, like how do the moving parts fit together and why? So this was the thinking that I started from, and this is what I went for in this particular direction. As it turns out, no one else has done this, so I might be burned at the stake for heresy again. But, shit happens.
You've got great work, Simon.
Yeah, well, I'm alive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You got fans, Simon. You got plenty of fans, brother. Keep going.
Huzzah!
Got plenty of support.
Okay. So, well, at least here. All right. So I was looking at China, and I went through a whole series of documents, and I came to this one, Made in China 2025. And basically diagnosed the fact that there was an industrial plan and how it really did change everything. And they really did. They had a plan that by 2049, control of all industrial actions on planet Earth, between heaven and earth, will be under the direct control of the Han dynasty in China. That is, they will own or control everything. And if you want to do anything industrial like buy a computer, you will do business with them on their terms. Okay, so that was that report said that in the fine print, but at the same time, the one on the left was what I was looking at on during the day during work, and then in the night shift on my personal time, I was reading the book on the right.
Mm-hmm.
And the book on the right was written by a defense scholar. He worked in the State Department. He served 8 U.S. presidents, so he was around for a very long time, and so he saw these things happen personally, and he knew the people that were happening. He spelt out in no uncertain terms that there is a 100-year marathon.
Mm-hmm.
That when Mao Zedong took power in 1949, they had a 100-year goal to reclaim the glory days of the Chinese Empire from thousands of years ago. They wanted their old position back. Now, what he described, so long-term, full-spectrum global domination through control of the industrial value chain by 2049. So the words industrial value chain are key here. So when we talk about geopolitics, usually they're talking about military actions. This is an industrial story.
Yeah, at least it's peaceful.
Yeah, hold on to that, will you?
Okay, sure.
It might not be.
Well, relatively speaking. But okay, go ahead.
Hold the phone. Right. So what Pillsbury said, so he described a situation across the 1970s and the 1980s where a whole lot of military defense analysts from the United States were invited to China. And they were told a story that, China's trying to evolve, we're trying to modernize. This is back when they weren't industrially very capable. They were still sort of trying to get organized. And said, we're having lots of problems. We've got corruption problems. We're not as strong as we'd like to be. There was a whole series of things. China's weak. We need your help. If you help us, we'll screw the Russians. Incidentally, at the same time, they told the Russians, if you help us, we'll screw the Americans. And what they were doing was putting forward the idea that China was weak, but it was heading towards a democracy and free markets. And it was encouraging investment to flow in. And the military analysts were all told the same thing, and they all believed it. And people in the private sector at the similar positions were told the same thing.
Was this in the 90s or
80s and 90s?
80s and 90s, okay. Mm-hmm.
Right, so over a period of time, but in particular from 1990 onwards, right, it turns out the Tiananmen Square massacre was a decisive turning point. The Hawks took over. So anyway, so what was basically happening here is, are you seeing the full screen, by the way?
Yes, long full spectrum global domination.
Yeah, okay, right.
Yeah, okay.
So what they basically said here was they were told China was weak, they needed help. They convinced this generation of analysts to go back to the United States and then brief all the power structures there that China was weak and it needed their help and they could be an asset to screw the Russians. That then flowed to the private sector, and JP Morgan and other groups invested a gazillion dollar amount, a huge amount of money into China and trained them up to be super duper capitalists and how to run businesses. And the Chinese absorbed all of it. And it turned out to be not true. The idea that they were going towards democratic markets, no, not true. Like a democracy or free trade, no. They had something else entirely planned. Right. So once I picked up on this plan, I went down the rabbit hole to actually do my research on this, not just in industrial. Like I've got all these numbers to show you later, but I was also looking at how the Chinese paradigm came about. So when I was a lad, 20, 30 years ago, I read these books thinking I knew everything about Chinese history. And then you had the Japanese Book of Five Rings and the Shogun Scrolls. And I thought, oh, yes, I'm an educated man. I know. And it turns out this was the polite Boy Scout point of view. This was the nice version.
Oh, yes. I know Dan is actually in the chat saying this. Did you, Dan, did you want to comment?
Yeah, it's in the book, The Art of War. Exactly one of the exact same lessons out of The Art of War. Make yourself look like you're weak while you're building strength. It's one of the...
Exactly.
Yeah.
This whole presentation...
I grew up in Japan, guys. A bunch of us in the military knew what was going on back in the 80s and 90s.
Yep. Yep. And it's I guess I found the same pattern, and would you call it proof that the industrial world has had something similar happen to it as well, which means we've got a pants down moment coming.
Yep.
True. All right. So in order of, so I read a series of books. So I read this one. This was actually the idea of Thucydides' trap, where Thucydides was a historian who lived in ancient Greece, and he saw the war between Athens and Sparta. He had 18 case histories where 18 times there was an incumbent empire and there was a challenger to challenge that incumbent empire. And 12 of those times they went to war, and 6 of the times they didn't. So what does it take? And what it came down to, the war was caused by fear of the incumbent power of what the rising power might do. So instead of like a peaceful transition of power, no, we're going to go to war, and then it all ends in tears.
So it was like a hallucination.
It was, but it turned into a reality.
Right.
And so, right. Okay. So then there was this little, this was written by 2 Chinese colonels, and it was 1999. This was based on the Gulf. They studied the Gulf War of 1991, and they said even though it's like a footnote in American history, that war forever changed what we call military conflict, and it changed the doctrine completely. And they were studying it very, very carefully. I've got all these books, and when you actually read them, it's a bit heavy going. War Without Rules is someone who's actually looked at this book and has actually done like a translation and a discussion of what it means in the Western mindset. The very fact that there is a Western mindset versus an Eastern mindset to need the translation of what it all means is actually part of what I'm trying to say here. We have fundamentally misunderstood what we're dealing with. So then the last one in 2020, military science in their own words. This also came from the Chinese military and from the Aerospace Institute. So all of this was an attempt at the evolution of the art of war into the modern world. Now, this is actually pertinent to what we're doing. I'm going somewhere with all this. So then I was looking at the history, some of the history angles. Like the strategies of the warring states was an era of Chinese history where all these states were at war with each other, and they were trying to do each other in the most amazing roller coaster of monkey business. The mentality that was developed at that time has rippled through Chinese culture and is actually very much influencing the thinking of how China sees the rest of the world now. So the strategies of the warring states is sort of like the description of their current paradigm. So when we try and interact with the Chinese, what do they see and what do they think about us? And do they take us seriously? Within that, you've got 36 strategies of ancient China that were actually discussed. It was sort of like a precursor to the art of war. And there's the 7 military classics, and you get your basic history and all that. So there's 3,000 years of history and culture here. With they say 5,000, but that goes back to the Neolithic era. When we're talking about societies and civilizations, it's about 3,000. Here's our mistake. We make the mistake of assuming that we here in the West have the best system, and because it's the best system and we're rich, everyone wants to be like us. And everyone thinks like us.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And it's bollocks.
It's true.
Absolute bollocks. Right. And we've been encouraged to think in these sort of terms. The phrase "never interrupt an adversary when they're making a mistake."
Yeah.
That's what we're doing.
That's what they're doing. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, Simon, it goes back to China's a 5,000-year-old culture.
Yeah.
India has 6,000 years worth of written history. These are ancient cultures. So unless you live in the part of the world, you're not connecting the dots.
That's what I was saying before. I'm talking about China, but we need to actually do the same sort of analysis for all these other countries, where India and Russia and South Korea and Japan.
Persia is another one.
All of them. And so it's from this particular paradigm, how do they think and what do they do? And the West is seen from a historical perspective as bullies and bullshit artists. we might think we're the shit, but actually, I think this era of history, unless we turn this around and clean this up, we're not going to be seen as well as we like. Anyway, so these two books, same author. The one on the right was how often was the use of deceit and deception used in Chinese strategy? And the answer is it is so commonplace. All the what we call dirty tricks and everything, like all the things that are frowned upon, that's standard practice for them. That's they'll just do that to the point where they think it's very strange that their adversaries won't.
Could you give an example?
Well, okay, so they'll do things like there'll be like a warring. This is from the warring states, and they'll do something like one army is on one side of the river and the other side is on the other side of the river. They will then release a prisoner who's trying to escape, and the prisoner is then caught and interrogated, and it turns out he's a relatively high-ranking military officer, and he gives false information.
Oh, okay.
And he convinces people to attack, but they attacked in a way where they end up massacring a local civilian population. The civilian population was used as bait. No, they won't attack. They won't attack the civilians. Well, actually, yeah, they did. All the ethical boundaries in terms of no, we wouldn't do that. Deception followed by casualties. It's who wins, and what are the conditions of winning. So it's all that. The one on the left is the actual tactics they would use to do that. Like this is like, and in terms of intelligence, the number of times they would use a sexual entrapment in a honeypot strategy.
Oh yes, I've read about those.
but they had all the dirty tricks, and they were all standard practice. Like sending in food that's poisoned.
Centuries old.
But this is not a.
I mean, it's not unique. Like
no.
I mean, Europeans have done, their own poison blankets and.
You might say that, but when we are actually interacting with the Chinese at the moment, we think, well, we're in a rules-based order, and there is the law, and we've got agreements, and those agreements will be adhered to, and everything's fine, and we can have a group hug. Horseshit. Sorry. And what I'm trying to show here is this is their foundation. We've got a foundation that's similar. Right. So I can't see any comments, by the way. So if comments are coming up, then
yes. Well, I know that the most common rebuttal to the rules-based order is that the rule, like from China and Russia, and others, is that the rules are for everyone other than the U.S. and the U.S. doesn't care, and so why should they follow them?
Again, you're talking about a culture that's thousands of years old. How they view the world is different from us.
Yep.
They look at we're a youngin, an upstart in their playground.
So I've got
that's what you have to understand about their culture.
I've got a slide coming of how they studied us and what they came to. So then I actually went through these books. So the three on the left are about what's happening in China at the moment in terms of their surveillance state. They've rolled out a police state to control their domestic population, and that was actually to a strategy that was put on the ground decades ago. But there's a reason for it, and it comes down to they've realized the importance of controlling domestic perception and the flow of information, as well as the flow of information and perception of what's happening internationally. Their greatest fear, it seems, is a domestic uprising within China. And they do have quite a lot of civil unrest that we don't have any visibility of. Anyway, so these books are really scary, and they're not very nice to read, everything like that. But the reason I'm doing it is, how does the PRC manage the society? But saying the quiet part out loud, if the 100-year marathon is successful and they've got control of everything, then Chinese leadership will start to dominate all other cultures around the world. What would it mean for those cultures? And we're already seeing it, things like there are police stations in Australia to police Chinese citizens on Australian soil. What?
Simon, they broke up a police station up in New York City, was raided by the FBI last year. And that's what they were for. They were basically policing Chinese in the United States.
Yep. Yeah, so that has implications, and there is a phase to all this where at the moment the Chinese are don't look at us, we're harmless, followed by this sort of passive aggressive approach. There's going to come a point when the veil lifts and they're just going to go off the chain, and we're going to be dealing with a fundamentally different animal. The book on the right is a historical book of how the Chinese civil service was put together and what did it all mean. And this was to actually sort of try and understand what the Chinese would try to implement on the cultures it now controls, if they're successful. When I say if they're successful, I'm going to show you how far along they are on this. Okay. So then there was the idea of fifth generation warfare. This book is just one of the books, but it's written for the educated layperson. It is politically agnostic, and it's a good introduction. This one is written for military strategists and is hard to read, and you've got to read it a couple of times to work out what the hell they're talking about. This is your classic, this person's got a good idea, but they can't write. And these... the one in the middle is very technically heavy, and it's good, but you really got to want to bash your way through it. Whereas if you want to actually sort of have an introduction to what you're sort of seeing, the one on the right is the best.
Mm-hmm.
The one on the left, or the two on the left, is written by retired General Michael Flynn. Now, this is not politically agnostic. This would be, I suppose you'd call them the MAGA group and everything. But so once you actually look past their political leanings, this is actually the most effective description of what fifth generation warfare is. It's written like a military manual, and it's written for in a way that's simple to understand. So once you actually sort of look past the political bias, that's actually the most effective tactical manual.
And can you just give us in a nutshell kind of what, for our viewers, what is fifth generation warfare?
Okay, so fifth generation warfare.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, sorry, Andrew. So there's multiple generations of warfare. So let's say the first generation of warfare is anything prior to gunpowder, for simplicity. Like there are other ways you can split this up, but someone invented gunpowder and put it in muskets. That was second generation. Yeah, that was the Napoleonic era. Wear bright red coats, stand in lines, and shoot at each other because you can.
Mm-hmm.
And the mentality from that era often carries over to the next one. Generation 3 was the idea of making some sort of technology. So you've got the machine gun, you've got the tank, you've got the grenade, you've got the bomb, the artillery piece, and all the way up to the nuclear bomb. Anything technology to actually kill people. And from generation 2, you had this idea of military discipline, which carried over to generation 3, where orders from, say, walk slowly towards that machine gun nest came from. And it's like each generation would change, but our military doctrine changes, but our thinking has to change. Like at the moment, the military doctrine has changed where carrier groups are quite vulnerable now, where that's still the heart of the Western...
the aircraft carriers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, it's that sort of thing. Right, so fourth generation is psychological warfare. So all forms of military warfare have already existed from the beginning, all of them. And I sort of see it as like which one was dominant at a time. So when the Vietnam War came around, psychological warfare was used to demoralize the adversary, that would be us, to the point where we were not capable of functioning as a fighting force anymore. Fifth generation warfare is a warfare of ideas. So we will now change the ideas of our enemy without them realizing it. Now, fifth generation warfare is the idea of using economics, or they'll send in like a group of people into their nation state civilian, and they'll set about destabilizing that nation state by setting up a movement, and that movement will cause trouble.
Oh, like those color revolutions.
Exactly. That was the example I was going to use. Like Black Lives Matter. That's another example of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so they'll stir up trouble, and you'll have parts of society turning on themselves because ideas have been implanted all with it, the idea of the very laws that actually protect society have been weaponized against society.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a couple of generations of warfare after that. I see sixth generation warfare as like consciousness weaponized, things like MK Ultra, and what have you. Seventh generation warfare is the idea of it's medical, as in we're going to implant a large population with a medical something medical or a poison or something like that, and without them realizing it, we're going to destabilize a large population. Eighth generation warfare for me is when the environment is being somehow altered to damage a population or damage a society, and we're seeing examples of that. So fifth generation warfare is all the rage at the moment. So here's how it sort of goes.
Mm-hmm.
So fifth generation warfare is anything is up for grabs. Anything that can be used to benefit society can now also harm it. There are no boundaries. Civilians are now the soldiers. So cyber warfare, psychological and society control, political control. In America, there's a lot of disruption politically, and a lot of the politics involved do track back to foreign adversaries who have been sort of exerting control. I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party has been exerting control in various sectors of the American political landscape for some time, and that's still allowed to happen. Mm-hmm. So culture, technology, economic warfare, proxy and non-state actor. Right. So you've got all these things that are really hard to get hold of, and most people go, I don't get it. Right. So what happens is you've got a strategy put together with game theory, where how do the parts fit together? Well, you do this, and that, and then we get this outcome. This is where the leadership resides, and it's invisible. A fifth generation warfare strategy is classic when the target has no idea they're even at war. It's just that everything's a bit shit and they don't know why. Right. So all soldiers, peoples, and units move with one mind to one goal. And that is the in the unrestricted warfare manual, which is basically fifth gen warfare. That is the thing that comes through again and again and again. There's got to be one strategy, and there's got to be coherency. Otherwise, the strategy itself gets ripped apart. Also, fifth generation warfare tends to be in what's called a waterfall structure. Things have got to happen in a particular order, and it's not till you get to close to the end that it's anything effective. So, if fifth generation strategy is diagnosed early, it will tend to collapse. So anything that could be used to influence or assist society can be used to harm it, and anyone and anything is now considered a military asset that is expendable. And this is something that we don't get. Now, so we have been at war. I see two clear adversaries and a third indistinct adversary against the Western world at the moment. So there's more than one something happening, but we have definitely been in a conflict in this context now for some decades.
Simon?
Yeah.
Simon, here recently we had the No Kings protests.
Yep.
We've traced the money from that, came all the way back to African American that's living in China right now.
Funny that.
So we were able to trace that back, and we've got a warrant out for his arrest. So if he ever shows up in a Western airport, his little tail end's going to get snagged up.
So that, I believe a lot of the monkey business we're seeing in the United States is actually theater, and is actually a cover for this. And if that is true, then eventually that monkey business will move to Europe in some form. So it's coming.
I just wanted to mention one of the biggest foreign actors we haven't mentioned, which is Israel. Israel obviously has control of most of the U.S. Congress,
and they're very effective at propaganda control and like non-military action, non-military strategies to achieve strategic outcomes.
Yeah, just to add to what Andrew's saying, the rest of you here in this call, we came within 2 or 3 weeks of oil being $300 a barrel easily.
Yep.
Oh yeah.
Because the military, United States military, we said, don't screw up the Persian Gulf. It's not the Straits of Hormuz. It's if you take out the Ayatollahs, the Persian Gulf will be burning. All those refineries and port facilities, it'll take us years to rebuild. and oil will be $300 for years. It'll destroy.
Well, that would make hydrogen economical.
It would help me out, but it doesn't help me when everybody's bankrupt in the process.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, a smoother transition is good. So it's praise God we got peace in the Middle East.
Yeah, and what you're saying, yes.
So this is nothing new to us. This is actually something that's been applied by the other adversary that we're looking at. This is a book that was released by accident a couple of decades ago, Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. It actually describes how to set up an economic weapon in a game theory context to actually work out what to do. So this is nothing new to us. It's part of our society. It's happening all around us. It's just that no one happened to tell the voting public. All right, moving along. So China, what history told Mao? So there was what?
Roger had his hand up. Did you have something about that particular book, Roger? Did you know how to unmute?
I don't hear the. I don't see the comments.
Oh well, yeah. He raised his hand, but okay.
Oh,
we'll go on for now. When he unmutes, yeah.
We can do this later. All right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so the Opium Wars between 1839 and 1890, like what Great Britain did and other nations did to China, really was a war crime. And it's all been brushed under the carpet now. But this is actually what's being used to motivate Chinese society at the moment.
Yes, that's true.
There's a ruthless study of what really happened. Actually, see if I can... Oh, cool. A laser pointer. Look at that. But now I've lost the ability to click. Hang on. All right. So in 1926, Mao published a study where he mapped out the proportions and classes of Chinese society, and he split it into three. There was the landlord, or the rich people class. You had the middle class, and you had the poor, proletariat. And he worked out what would be needed to rile up the poor, take away the weapons and the ability for the rich to actually do anything about it, and then give those weapons to the poor, and then give them transport to get them to the right place at the right time. It was a naked power grab. This guy was a piece of work. But he also studied Darwin, as in Charles Darwin, in the context of why some economies and nations succeeded and why some failed. So they're trying to work out, we used to be a big, powerful, world-class economy thousands of years ago. This is China. How do we get it back? Why did we fail, and why do these upstarts, why are they successful with this thing called industry? So they were studying this very, very carefully in the early 1900s. Unfortunately, it seems that there was a mistranslation. Survival of the fittest became elimination by the strong. So what they would often say was the strong nation states will devour and eat the weaker nation states. And if they didn't become strong, someone would do that to China. They also studied the United States. How did the USA surpass Great Britain and Europe? When, what the US did versus what it said it did, and what its PR reputation is, two very different things. So, what we call gunpowder diplomacy and industrial espionage and dodgy shit happened more often than not, and it was all behind the scenes. And they also looked at the role of the private company versus the state government when interacting with foreign nations. Like a private American company will take a piece of technology from Europe, and the government in America would go, oh, that's nothing to do with us. They're private organizations. We'll send the cops around to have a chat to them, and of course nothing happens. Anyway, so that was all looked at in detail about how the United States became so powerful so quickly. Now, they also in the 1950s studied World War II. The majority of successful strategic focused on the destruction of the enemy's industrial capability and the enemy's supply of strategic resources. So the lack of experienced personnel became important later, but in the beginning, it was not just resources, but the enemy's industrial capability. So the theft of cutting-edge technology and the assassination of enemy scientists. And what they realized was the development of domestic industrial capability and production was more important than casualties taken. So what I'm just saying here is The Chinese now believe they're at war for dominance, and they believe the arena for control is not military, it's economic, in context of heavy industry where they own and control that heavy industry. Right.
I just wanted to add, because we got the picture of Mao that and his studies and such, that while they were on march, they were carrying him, and he had like a pile of books, and he was like he read like hundreds of books, and back then that was a very big thing.
So compared to Lenin, he was an intellectual midget, but he was also a power-hungry lunatic.
Oh,
right?
Okay. Well,
yeah. So yeah. Anyway, so what's now happening? Yeah, you had a question?
No.
Nope. Okay.
Go ahead.
Right. So what's happening now? So China's been preparing for decades. So this is Tiananmen Square. They've been so history has been terraformed. So this is the Michael Pillsbury viewpoint that's actually come up a few times now from different authors, where what's been taught at all levels of education is a sanitized version of history. You've now got a generation of scholars who absolutely believe, with the understanding that if they go against the party or say anything against the party, that they're done.
Yeah.
Their family's done. So you've now got like a whole generation of people intellectually not understanding what's happened. There's this big monument at the edge of Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square massacre was a turning point. That's when the Hawks just took over. So we're going to do things differently now. Written in Chinese on this thing, I don't speak Chinese, but I'm going to take the author's word for it, is extolling what happened in the Opium Wars, in the century of shame. Right, and so then you've got the Chinese History Museum. It's bigger than the Louvre.
Wow.
Also in Tiananmen Square, and they built it, but in it they've actually got this like a very stylized version of history. So they've actually edited people's understanding of their own history, and that's there's reasons for that. So Chinese society is being motivated and mobilized by remembering what happened in the Opium Wars. 1989, the Yingpai Hawks took over, and so the 1990s was when we started seeing all this stuff happen. 2049 is the 100-year target for when the 100-year anniversary of when Mao Zedong took power. PRC government diagnosed the United States in particular as their long-term enemy, and their greatest strategic concern was the internet. This was back in the 90s. When it was just done. The need for control of the flow of information domestically and internationally was very apparent, and they needed to shape that information to camouflage China's true progress. And they saw the internet as a weapon of opportunity, and they got organized, and that's the infrastructure that's in place has taken a long time to build, but they've been putting serious resources into it.
I just wanted to add to this that at least the Chinese scholars that I talked to, like the official story anyways that I was getting, is that the Tiananmen Square was an attempted color revolution by the United States, and they're like, and so that's at that point the Hawks took over because they're like, oh well, we can't trust the U.S. anymore.
That's
because
exactly
they
right.
tried to take us over.
So they absolutely don't trust us, and they'll weaponize anything they can get hold of. But they will do the same and worse. All right. So here's the raw material policies. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, and the first National Mineral Resource Plan appeared. So, okay. And after that, you've got a series of plans that have come out. And then there was the Made in China 2025 and the One Belt, One Road initiative. This is all part of a macro plan with a target of 2049 with certain goals, and they're deadly, deadly serious. But before they made their move in 2001, everything was in place. So 1989 was the flashpoint. Across the 1990s was when they actually were getting their strategy together. But by the time the year 2000 actually happened, they made the move economically. But before all that, militarily, everything was mapped out. So, cost of doing business. The industrial strategy deployed by the Chinese Communist Party for the last couple of decades has been very effective. So the cost of operations in China was driven down and kept down. The cost of labor was very cheap. Regulations to facilitate economic activity in Chinese terms was quite strong. Environmental compliance was kept to a minimum in exchange for economic advancement. So the way they worked is Chinese companies would compete with each other ruthlessly in ways that we would consider illegal. It's more like a mafia thing. It's like, how does a mafia do business with other mafias? That's how the internal Chinese things seem to work, and they'd happily knife each other. And the companies that were successful, they would rise to the top of the pile, and they're run by psychopaths.
Hey,
They're
Simon,
the one. Yeah.
Simon, wouldn't you? I think a lot of us have said it's not really communism; it's a lot closer to fascism.
Yeah,
where you
that's
have
right.
large corporations, government merged together.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. But they still call themselves the Chinese Communist Party. But it's all about power, and they've left the whole thing of communism behind a long time ago. So, but what the Chinese government will step in. They control about a third of the Chinese economy. I think it's about a third. But the things they'd invest in are companies that are proven to be effective. And when they're effective, they're psychopaths. And so the psychopaths will then say, right, when you present yourself to the rest of the world, it's a united front. So psychopaths companies would then go out with the full backing of the Chinese vertically integrated system. So when they come up against like Western companies that tend to be like small and organic, they get the crap beaten out of them. Anyway, so it made sense to actually move a lot of industrial stuff to China since the 1970s. But the underwriting thing was that the company had to be 51% Chinese owned on Chinese territory, which meant intellectual property would then be transferred and shared. So what would happen is you'd have a business, you want to get rich, okay, send it to China, and they will make you a lot of money. The Chinese, you go into partnership with someone there, and the Chinese have 51% control, and all your intellectual property gets signed over. So 10 years later, all of a sudden, you don't have a company anymore; it's theirs. And anything that's good and effective all around the world flowed into China, and this happened over decades. And again, you had the likes of J.P. Morgan Bank mentoring their infrastructure, how to become internationally competitive and effective at all levels. Right, so this was the Chinese economy in 2022. So this is what I used 2022, but that's when the data was consistent. You had state-owned enterprises, 25% of China's GDP, and they had policies as well, but it was a decisively important 25%. So there's the 17.88 trillion USD GDP, and it was split into these sectors. So what I've done is taken each of these sectors and mapped them out. Right, let's get into the data. So what I've done here, so let's go back. Let's say we've got electronics and automobiles. Okay, electronics and automobiles. So globally, how big was the business? And that was the green section here. And the blue is how big was the Chinese sector and what was the market share. And then I went to, once you got the market share, what happened in China, how much it was for domestic consumption and how much it was for export. And most of the time, 70%, 80%, 65%, the market was for domestic. The domestic market was huge, much larger than exports. So this is pharmaceuticals. And all right, let's go to the second one. So it's this the last half of that list. So all the major sectors in the Chinese economy, they've got a commanding share of the global market. And where most of it is going to domestic consumption. So while they're supporting the rest of the world, they're also doing things domestically.
Oh yeah,
right. Yeah. So what that means is, the idea that if we have sanctions and tariffs applied against China and everything collapses, they're done. They're going to crash economically. Not true.
Yep.
In a wartime footing, they're quite self-sufficient. Parts of the economy will be disrupted and everything, but you often see all these articles and videos about how China's ending, China's in deep trouble. What are we going to do? The sky is falling. I think that is another gigantic PR exercise to convince us China is a lot weaker than it actually is.
Simon, can I point out something? One of my bigger complaints about all these sanctions Yeah, 'cause I'm an IT guy, so I'm involved in the banking piece of this. All these sanctions are dollar based. What's going on right now is 20% of the world's oil market is not done in dollars, and it's going on between Russia and China, and it's done in their own currencies. So these sanctions have no effect when these countries are not using the dollar.
Someone goofed.
It's propaganda.
Yeah, but that propaganda serves a purpose. And that's that back to the 5th generation warfare stuff I was talking about. It serves a purpose. So now we're getting into the data. All right, so this was for the year 2022. What material feedstocks went into global manufacture? And you know, most of it was steel, then you got aluminium and copper. And right. So this is the world. What's the China footprint here? Rare earth elements is a really, really small proportion, right? But they've got most of the intellectual capacity, both in Europe and the United States, flagellating themselves over rare earth elements. Now, yes, rare earth elements are important, but 20 years ago, we weren't using them. And in 20 years' time, technology might be different. We might not need them again. And so, yes, while they're important for now, watch this. That's steel. So not just mining, look at the smelting. There is aluminium. There is copper, zinc, nickel, tin, titanium, but also plastics, rubber, ceramics, glass, and back one. Right, they've got a commanding position in every sector on that graph.
Wow.
And it's not mining, it's production, it's smelter, it's metal production and manufacture. When we talk about this, is the critical raw materials is about control. It's about control of supply, where we're at risk of a supply. Why one nation has a commanding position, right? But it's not minerals in the ground that we're worried about. It's access to cars and computers and mobile phones. But where does that come from? I make the case. Now I've got some more data to show here, but the smelting level, the smelting and refining of chemicals into precursor materials is the bottleneck that controls everything else. And while we've been convinced to chase our tail on the mining of minerals, China has quietly developed massive industrial capacity to the point where now that it's built, it's going to be very, very hard to outcompete them. Right. So this is what's called the critical raw materials list. And these are all the countries that have such a list. Now, the number of minerals and metals on the list is down the bottom here. So like USA has 50, Russia has 38. And so China is actually producing material in this line here. So they've got a massive chunk of all CRM lists. Now, you might think, well, does that mean that China's got more minerals than anyone else? No, they've got the same mineral proportions as everyone else. The difference is they're using what they've got, and we are not. Now, that has an implication later, because if that means they're going to exhaust their resources faster than we will. Right. So as we get into the data, I've put together this idea with my friend and colleague Patrick. I work with. A global market share, if it's controlled by a single country, if it's less than 25%, you've got free market conditions. If it's more than 30%, these are two different studies that came up with this. If it's more than 30%, the country can influence market price. If it's more than 50%, the market can influence physical supply. And if it's more than 75%, the country can dictate terms. Right, so here's the blind spot number one. Countries don't mine. Corporations do. Private corporations. And private corporations are owned by, well, foreign investment. But China is a place where the state does actually control what actually happens in China. But others, not so much. And that's a blind spot. So here's some data. So what you've got on the columns here, USA, NATO, Europe, and what is it? If it's colored up, it means that particular metal is what's called on the critical raw materials list. Most of the time, it's mining. Right? So if it's red, it's mineral reserves. If it's black, it's mining. If it's blue, it's metal production and precursor production. If it's green, it's recycling. And the numbers are all the references that come with it. So there's China, there's the world, and the last column is the China percent fraction of the world. Now, so back to this graph here, that percent is talking to the final right-hand column.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's go through this. As you can see.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, all right, so that's one. It's two. Again, so this is lead. They've got their grubby little pores and everything. 89% magnesium metal.
Mm-hmm.
And because they do most of the manufacturing, they've got most of the recycling.
Mm-hmm.
And they're in a vertically integrated system run by a psychopath mafia.
Yeah.
Right, so this is the metals. And so this is when you take the average of all those statistics. In terms of mining mineral reserves, they've got as much as proportional to their territory.
Mm-hmm.
They are mining more than anyone else because they're using what they've got. They've got a commanding position in production and recycling because they've got the manufacture there. Right, so I've taken copper, Dr. Copper, and I've mapped this out. So traditionally, we're after how much copper was mined for that particular year in the world, and then we might look at it by country, and that's as far as it goes. I've taken the analysis and I've taken it further. So this is precursors.
What's up, man?
So sorry, I accidentally I was trying to mute Dan, and I accidentally muted Simon. Simon, can you unmute and redo your video? Simon, can you hear me? Simon? Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and then your video too.
Yeah. Okay. So
Okay.
how long was that?
Oh.
How long was it? Just the last slide?
Yeah, it was just the last slide. Yeah. It was just a few seconds ago.
Okay. Share window. Okay.
Yeah, I think someone came to visit Dan. Yeah.
Prior screen. Okay, share, and then we go to.
Yes, this is the
Okay.
slide. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
Are you guys finding this interesting? This is a little bit off the beaten track. I thought it was relevant.
Yeah, no, I like it.
Okay, good. All right. So this is what we do normally. We're looking at copper. So normally they'll mine what's in the rest of the world, and they'll mine what's in by country, and that's as far as it goes. I've taken it and I've extended the analysis. The copper concentrate that's mined, some of it's imported, some of it's domestic. How much of it goes into China, and what do they do with it? How many smelters are they running? Right, and what are they producing, and what's the scrap, and what's the recycling? Okay, once they've got all that, what happens to it? It gets sent off to manufacture. Right, what are they manufacturing? What are they producing? How much?
Mm-hmm.
So here's the pertinent piece of information. So that's it all together. The pertinent piece of information is, where does it go? And only 10 to 15% goes to export. Something like 90% goes to domestic manufacturing companies. So what that means is, we think that it's like stuff flows into China and then it flows out to the market and it's distributed evenly. No, a lot of it's domestic, and it's all part of a vertically integrated plan that they've organised their own supply. So if we're going to sort of exert, if they think they're in a conflict, right, and they think that the keys to survival in that conflict is control over industry, the ability to destroy the enemy's industry, and the ability to protect and control domestic industry, they've got all the building blocks in place now. And that has been missed by everyone in my field that I've come across so far. And so how much of what is flowing here across the world is used domestically, and what for? So I've put forward the idea that we've got to start doing these sorts of analysis. So we're going to go all of those metals that actually control industry, not just rare earths. And even rare earths, the data's really dodgy. Plastics, fertilizers, fresh water, there's now nation states in India and Pakistan going to war with each other, or trying to go to war with each other over fossilized water reserves. Fertilizers, growing of food, but also the problem of the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles being overloaded, and plastics, the amount of plastics flowing into the oceans and what have you. We also need to do this for all the energy stuff, which is still not seen as that interesting or useful. And we've got to do it for these nation states as well. So the big ones are up the top. And for Finland, their future resource security is what I call the Nordic frontier. India is the dark horse. It's a massive population, and they have very little resource consumption per capita at the moment. But they want to do what China has done over the last 50 to 60 years. And they're looking at doing that. And if they do that, they'll upend the whole resource sector. Right, minerals, industrial minerals, same basic idea. Where's this stuff being produced? Yeah, like and fluorspar, that actually makes the electrolyte in batteries. That's why it's there.
Oh, okay.
So graphite, 67% mining. So industrial minerals. So yeah, same basic pattern. This stuff's not looked at because it's not sexy, but we absolutely need all this stuff. It's just considered not a problem. Fertilizers. What's the fertilizer footprint? And here's energy. All right. So this is the China's the only one that sees oil, gas, and coal and uranium as an energy thing that's worth considered critical to look at. Everyone else doesn't think it's a problem, right? And that's very telling. China actually does stuff we don't. So, all right. There's gas, extraction and consumption, and there's coal, extraction and consumption. More or less self-sufficient. Not completely, but more or less. Oil, they're only producing 28% of their, or 29% domestic production. So oil is their Achilles heel. But what this means, that's transport. That's their transport grid. But if they did the Chinese thing where they didn't mind where their civilian population starved to death, they've still got 28.9% of domestic production. And so it's not all the oil. But what they do have is their industrial system is more or less self-sufficient. The idea that we can cut them off at the knees and control them, that's bollocks.
Yeah, I just wanted to also add to that that they're much more food sustainable than most Western nations even.
Yeah. So, and in fact, going back to this, where is it? No, not this one. Come on. There, here we are. Okay. So, global agricultural products, including food. Right. So that's 80% consumption. So they did import some food, but it wasn't a lot compared to what they were producing. And if they actually then had some efficiency measures in place, they could actually sort that out. So on one slide, I have the entire Chinese economy mapped up against the global economies. All right. So go back to where we were before. Okay, there's ammonia, there's energy. Here is precious metals. They also see gold as a critical raw material, and the only other country that does that is Russia. Everyone else thinks that's fine.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So this is their energy consumption and electricity production. And so, yeah. Right, environmental fallout. This is the stuff that doesn't get done very often. So I went down the rabbit hole on this. This is actually to round off the analysis. Since the 1980s, China has built 10,000 petrochemical plants or thereabouts along the Yangtze River alone, and 4,000 along the Yellow River, right? And they're all doing dodgy stuff, and there is no environmental compliance. So now they've got the phenomenon of the cancer village, where you've got clusters of cancer and really bad health problems, and the Chinese government goes, "Oh, we don't care if you die or not," and so they're allowed to progress. And so, right, why is that? So the villages are situated near factories and mining sites and chemical pollutants. And well, this is some. These are paragraphs pulled out of something I wrote recently. So it said, look, air pollution. So urban concentrations of between 30 and 50 micrograms a meter cubed in measurements, but you've got a recommended limit of 5. Right, so it's up to 10 times the limit. Yeah, right. So soil, okay. Soil nationwide, 16% is contaminated with heavy metals. So what that means is 19.4% of agricultural soil is contaminated with heavy metals going directly into food.
Wow.
So then we've got, cadmium. You're allowed 1 part per million, but they often find up to 50. Lead, you're allowed 60 part per million, but you've got some cases going up to 500. Arsenic, you're allowed 5 parts per million, but they're finding ranging from 10 to up to 200. Mercury, if they find it at all, it's a problem, but they put it at 0.5 ppm. There are lots of cases that are several ppm, and that information was hard to get hold of, so I think it's actually worse than that. Water, this is the one that really blew me away. Yeah, check this out. 40% of Chinese rivers and water flow are seriously polluted, where 20% of its rivers, the quality is too toxic to touch safely, let alone drink.
Wow. To touch.
So 55% of the groundwater in China is unfit for drinking because of all the waste that's being dumped into those rivers. And there's an estimated 60,000 premature deaths annually. That's a bullshit number. You have to remember that China is such a large population, so 60,000 isn't a lot.
No.
It would be substantially higher than that. So there comes a point when this is not enforceable, even in a police state. Right. So I'm going to pull this all together now in a series of conclusions. First, I'm going to do a timeline. What's happening? Why are we? Hang on. All right. So starts out, the system is normal, what I call the invisible 1,000 cuts.
Okay.
And then we get to a point where the system works, but there's visible signs of stress. This is the visible 1,000 cuts. And I put that flashpoint at 2005.
Who's getting these cuts?
Right, it's society at large. Things are going wrong.
In China or
this is the world?
The world. Okay.
This is the whole global system.
Okay.
Before 2005, more or less normal. Everything can be written off. Everything's fine. But since 2005, we've had a few things go wrong, and the temperature's rising. Then we get to 2019, and from 2019 to around now, it's been shit's on fire.
Mm-hmm.
Now, 2019, that's the repo market liquidity crisis in the West. And at the same time in China, their foreign exchange trade system crashed because banks wouldn't trust each other anymore. And that's at the heart of the industrial system that the global industrial system was that system, and it crashed. So from that point on, it's warning lights are all over the place and things are getting harder to ignore. There's going to come a point when I think we're going to see our crash, where it all crashes at once. We've got first little by little and then all at once. I think it's going to be something like that. Many of the old institutions and systems will be wiped out and new ones will form in their place. Now, there's 2025. What I'm just saying is we're not there yet, but it feels like it's right in front of us. Like I'd be astounded if we don't see some macro scale moves later this year. After the crash, we have adjustments as new structure forms. Whatever the new reality is, the foundations will form. But that, as destruction will be chaotic, from 2005 onward, it's been chaotic with increasing chaos. But the creation of the new system will also be chaotic. And there'll come a point when we have a new equilibrium, whatever that is. Right. All nation states, go on.
Oh, well, it's just that they all at once crash based on, Jean Laharere's graphs and things like that, and like food prices and all that. I've placed it somewhere in the mid 2030s, and like other documents I've read kind of all place it in the 2030s range.
Yep. Okay. Well, was basing that on what I was seeing in the finance markets,
Mhm.
and the finance markets, but also the dependency of industry on energy, and some of the moves I'm seeing geopolitically, like the BRICS dollar, the BRICS nations, the strategy they're unrolling with Ukraine was all about. And I'm seeing this in a holistic sense. I will be astounded if we get to the mid-2030s where that's something serious breaking. But that's an opinion, and it doesn't. Opinions. How things will work out, we don't know, and so
Yeah.
it may be right. So
Yeah.
okay.
And yeah, just want to we don't know exactly how, if it'll be, but I would definitely say a major transition point, where exactly we move from kind of a predominantly fossil fuel to a predominantly other way of life, and how that happens. I think it has a lot to do with more kind of the geopolitical rather than mineral constraints and things like that, because we have enough, like, say, land and resources for everyone. The issue is it's not being equitably distributed, and if it was, it could be a smoother transition instead of a crash, for example. But if there's a lot of hoarding and fear, then it would be a more sudden kind of thing. So
the point of this is the pale blue at this end is fundamentally different to the pale grey at the beginning. And
yes,
there's a gradation going through, and so it doesn't happen all at once. It happens in stages. Like the Roman Empire, the crash happened over a long period of time, but little by little, suddenly, shit's on fire, and then when things get really, really serious, they actually break, and there's, all right, we're going to fix it now, whatever that is, and then we get the new equilibrium. Now, the point of this chart is as follows: all nation states and large corporations have been preparing for this point, and consider it to be inevitable. And frankly, so is everyone else. I'm in this, like everyone on this call thinks like that. Many of the old institutions and systems we wiped out, new ones will form. That's not a surprise. Right. So how they position themselves, how can they position themselves in that new system, given that the old system is obsolete and irrelevant? So in the blue is where it's at. So what this means is every major player doesn't care if the market melts down or has a debt default or peak oil. They've been planning for it all along. It's just a question of timing. And that's the case for all of it. So if the market does rip itself to shreds and the Chinese export market crashes, do the Chinese care? Probably not. They just say, well, this is part of the process. We know what's going to happen now, but we know what to do next. And yes, it's going to be painful, but this is what we need. Okay. So that's my point here. So everyone's jockeying for that position. The Chinese are doing so as well, but they're not the only ones. Every nation state, every economy, every group, like the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, the British, the Europeans, they're all thinking in this terms. They know and understand that the existing finance system is toast. And the Great Reset of 2030. Right. So what happened in 2005? Right. So this is something I've shown before.
peak conventional oil too.
So yes, but this is actually this is an oil-based signature. So what I've got here is all the market prices for what the World Bank uses to track the health of the world economy at an industrial level. So I've taken the market price and I've indexed the number 100 to the month December 2001, which is in here. Right, and so the oil, what's this show periods of relative stability? The curves overlay. This period here was the Iranian oil crisis of 1979. But yeah, watch this. Boom.
Yeah.
Something happened in January 2005. So the US decouples from the gold standard there. There's the Iran oil embargo. The global financial crisis is actually in here. The fertilizer stuff is actually sort of muting it a bit, but so you've had like a major crash, economic crash. That didn't change whatever was causing this. The volatility is still there. And here's the COVID era, the gift that keeps on giving. So And so a case can be made that the blowout was a chain reaction that started in the oil industry, and a major economic correction did not resolve the problems. And the change started something like, well, gosh, it's not 18 years now. No, it happened back in 2005. So it's 20 years ago. So I could update that chart.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So what happened? What happened at this point here? Right. Oil production. This is conventional. Fracked oil did exist, but it wasn't very much. It wasn't until an evolution in horizontal drilling happened that it was able to take off. But in January 2005, it plateaued. Why did it plateau? You see this little dip here? That is the Iraq War of 2003 and took Iraqi oil off production offline.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and so the Saudis were told, you will now increase production. And so this one on the chart on the right, so the swing producer was Saudi Arabia, and so this is number of rigs. The line is their oil production, and so their production started falling, so they started bringing more rigs online. They were sweating their asset. So 146% increase in rig count in exchange for a minus 4% decrease in oil production.
Wow.
So, and that's sort of a chain reaction. But the Iraq War caused that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So oil supply, can't do it anymore. Okay, yeah. So, and here's what happened. So supply and demand, this is one of the really old charts where you had proper oil supply and demand together, so you could actually compare them. They don't like that anymore because they want to include biofuels.
Mm-hmm.
Right, here's price. So this hasn't been corrected for inflation. So it's spot price. And so what you've got is this. January 2005 to October 2009, it did do a plateau, but within that plateau, it separated between August 2006. And that was the speculation run-up. That was the speculation bubble. Supply and demand did actually separate for a bit. And
yes.
so then we've got the global financial crisis. The marker point was the peak of the oil price spike. And then we fix it by printing money.
Right. Yeah. And that's what raised the oil price.
And so then we've got fracking takes off and saves our bacon. Right. So the GFC was, in case we made, was caused by a chain reaction with its genesis in the oil industry. Quantitative easing was used to fix it. Fracking or tight oil was able to make up the supply shortfall. The US is now the global supply swing producer. And just for shits and giggles, I've done the same thing as the data before, but now I've actually put the pinpoint at 1970 January and the year and the month, number 100. That's that point there.
Mm-hmm.
And bang. So this is what happened when we decoupled the US dollar decoupled from the gold standard.
Wow.
And so the 73 oil embargo was the first trouble they had, and they just threw money at it.
Mm-hmm.
And that just sent everything nuts. Right, conclusions coming to the end. The Chinese can only do this for a while, so it's a race. So the fast growth that is consuming their domestic resources, they're getting flat. They got growth of like 7 or 8% a year, and this has been going on for decades. They can't keep doing that, right? So the environmental fallout will become unmanageable at some point too. So what I'm just saying is there's a timeline here. They've got to get certain things done by a certain time.
Mm-hmm.
The domestic economy is mostly self-sufficient on the fundamental basics. So the theory that China needs the USA consumer markets for its own survival is not correct. So if there was a trade embargo, yes, China would be hurt by that economically, and it would hurt them, but it would hurt the United States much, much, much more, and everyone else as well, because China makes the stuff and we don't. China is mostly self-sufficient in gas and coal, but not oil. So what I call the industrial fortress. In fact, that's a point. Let me go back a bit.
I know.
We're growing sleepy. So there's okay, where is cement? Right, cement. Here we are. Concrete production is a proxy for industrialization.
Mm-hmm.
Look at this. There is more more construction, civil engineering construction and industrialization happening inside China than the rest of the world combined.
Yeah.
And I call it the industrial fortress.
Mm-hmm.
So let's scrap that. We don't.
They have all those big dams and mountain canals, and
Yeah, and so
very impressive.
So, but it's not. They're doing this to a plan.
Mm-hmm.
It's a macro scale plan to a goal. All people and all assets move with one mind to one goal. They're not mucking around. Okay, back to where we were. Sorry about that. Okay. So it's mostly self-sufficient, at least in the medium term. There is a long-range plan. They call it the 100-year marathon. Parts of it are things like the Belt and Road Initiative and Made in China 2049. In that plan, they want control of. The Chinese believe, the Han Dynasty in particular, that they are the pinnacle of human achievement and evolution, and they believe it is their right and it's appropriate that they rule everyone else, and they want control of everything industrial and anything wealth-based between heaven and earth, and which means they want control of our stuff, and they're more than 60% of the way there, and they've got the money, and the smart money is, unless something happens to break them down internally, they're going to get to where they're going to go, because we are not paying attention to this. Right, prediction. China must take over resources outside of China at some point because they're consuming their domestic resources, or much of its infrastructure will become stranded assets because there's nothing to feed them. They must expand. 2, if other countries develop smelting capacity, then China would lose control of its 100-year marathon.
Oh.
Because it's build a smelter. How much money do we spend on the military? Build a smelter and then use it. Right. We've been encouraged or convinced ourselves to look at the wrong things. We should completely redevelop how we look at resources and from what paradigm. Include the whole value chain, in particular, smelting and refining. We should overhaul critical raw materials classification stream. The current one is bullshit. Yes, rare earth elements are important, but so are other things. Smelting and refining of precursor materials is probably the most sensitive and significant bottleneck. To get a smelter operational, to put it up, it does require a lot of capex and a lot of energy, and the business case for it is much harder to justify than starting a mine or a factory in many cases, because you need many mines to feed that for it to produce, and then you need a customer to sell the stuff to. So it's harder to get a smelter up than other assets. We should track capital flows, offtake agreements, who controls each of the major companies and in each industrial sector. Follow the money. This can be done, and I've actually proposed to do this. I haven't. The people to do it need funding. So, but this is the part that we're all looking at the wrong things, guys. And that's the end. All right. Stop sharing. Is there any questions? Are you still there?
Yes, Iver has a question, and there's 44 concurrent viewers too. Okay.
Okay. Guys?
Well, yeah, I was wondering, and this is for Dan also. I read an interesting thing the other day where they basically said oil is in trouble in West Texas, and it's kind of rolling over. And also, the price is not going up, it's going down. So I wonder if this is what happens at the end of a resource is, it doesn't matter what you do about it, like, okay, you're still making these widgets or something, and nobody really wants them as much as they did before. And I wonder if it is an energy transition or if it's just sort of a bug right now.
Gail Tverberg came up with a really interesting model where she had like a closing window. And the window was the price has to be high enough for producers to make money, but it also has to be low enough for consumers to be able to afford the oil and the oil products. And when that window closes, there's no more oil market, and it goes to something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they basically said that oil is cheaper now when priced in gold they said it was something like 56 barrels per ounce of gold than it has been in a long time. Even back when there were crises and stuff, it was not as ridiculously priced as it is now.
Iver, the reason why the oil prices are where they are right now has to do with consumption. The consumers just start consuming the fuel.
Yeah.
That's why the prices are. And basically, it goes back to what Simon said. If it goes up to a certain point, you will stop driving. And it can't go down to a certain point because the cost of production is what it is. We were able to fuel all this shale drilling for the last 15 years on cheap banking. The Federal Reserve just printing money and the banking system accepting it. And now that's over with. There's what's happening right now with the new bill that Trump got through. That only thing that's going to do is create inflation.
Oh, yeah.
Because the debt levels are too high.
Well, the inflation will paper over a bunch of problems. Probably it'll make it look like everything.
But it won't paper over the production, and it doesn't help us when we still something like 6 or 7 million barrels per day that we import in the United States. We're not energy self-sufficient. Whoever told people that is a liar. That is a lie.
So this is the idea that we're going to hit like a period where we have like little by little by little 1,000 cuts, but then at some point something's going to break, and then we're going to have to make a fundamentally new system.
Yeah,
that's what you're talking about there.
Right. Simon's got it. I mean, when I did my presentation, I showed you guys that yes, there's oil up in Alaska, but it costs $25 million per well. And you have to drill a minimum 9 wells. That's $225 million just to get something into the pipeline, right? The point is, it's getting to the point where it's there, but it's too expensive to mine. It's no different than like Simon and I talk about, like gold mining in the western part of the United States. There's plenty of gold out there. It's just not economical to mine.
And I just wanted to add that the money supply is the main thing that dictates the oil price. It's not really the supply and demand so much. Especially we saw Simon Michaux, he had those graphs about those, the 2008 and then the quantitative easing. During the quantitative easing was the highest prices because there was a lot of people that could spend a lot of money on oil. And that's why we had high prices. And now there isn't quantitative easing. All the governments are trying to reduce their budgets. And so the oil prices are low.
The economy is slower. There are fewer people consuming fuel.
Steve, I don't know if you had something relevant to this or a different a question.
Yeah. Thanks. Simon, great work as always. One of the questions we had an email exchange. I look at charts. When charts go up slow, they come down slow, just like a peak oil chart, right? When you look at China's massive industrial, it's like exponential. It happened in 25 years, really. And so when something goes up that way, I don't see it sustaining. So my issue is, and all those, the factors like the environment, the pollution, even though China will continue to grow, and I've got a presentation, hopefully, Andrii, next week. It'll dovetail what Simon had shown. I'll show you the major regions, an update on the major regions, oil and gas, who I think are the biggest problems. Also about what makes GDP grow, which is energy, and how the U.S. robbed that GDP from the rest of the world, and how going forward, China's going to get into trouble because the U.S. was able to increase its GDP even though its production of energy or consumption was flat. So what I want to ask you, Simon, what is your gut telling you about how long China can continue to grow and then maintain itself? Because the way it's increased this level of industrialization, and I'm hearing from YouTube channels, there are rolling blackouts that are taking place. And Guangdong and these different major industrial areas, and they're not talking about it because they've got all these data centers now. They have this AI. Everything is consuming a massive amount of energy, electricity, and in the summer when all these new homes that are taking air conditioning. So that's the question. It's been a long question, but what do you think is the sustainability? Forget everything else, all the different Chinese plans. Looking at the numbers, how long could China sustain this kind of growth and maintain it?
Probably not long. So you're absolutely right. I don't see this as a thing where they're developing slowly over time and the planets just keep growing into infinitum. They are working towards a particular plan with milestones. And some of those milestones are what capability is built internally, and some of those milestones are what happens internationally. And internationally, we've got a number of problems that are known by everyone on the board. Everyone understands that we've got the issues that you alluded to are known. So I think they are trying to get to a certain point where their adversaries break, like the West now falls over itself on one of the issues. And so if they were forced into a situation where nothing happens and they would just keep growing, I'd give them another 3 or 4 years, and then at maximum, maybe next year, it could all fall over. But I think they don't care about the growth. I think it's more a case of who wins, whatever game they think they're playing. And whatever that is, like I can guess, right? But there's a lot of camouflage in place. Once they get to a certain strategic point, certain capability is arranged. Western capability, on the other hand, there's a lot of problems in the United States with infrastructure failing and all sorts of things going wrong, and all at the same time. Yeah, why is that? Scratch his head. The net position that the United States will find itself if certain things happen versus China is, I think, the goal. What they're doing is they're destroying their own society by forcing such growth. The environmental pollution problems, they're terrible. The people who are the architects of that particular plan don't care about their own civilian population. That is clear. Right, but there'll come a point when there'll be a revolution. If they don't get something where it turns around, internally they'll start having problems that are so large that they'll be distracted by them. They'll forget about us. Answer your question, Steve, probably next year.
Okay. And Dusty and then Jean. Dusty, go ahead.
Yeah, Simon. So a lot of times I hear people in the context of China putting it very in imperial context, U.S. versus China. But I tend to wonder if there's actually a longer play for China that's much closer to home, specifically in regards Russia. We have, if you look at, for example, population density maps, you see like extreme density all along the border of China and Russia on the Chinese side, and literally like 2 people on the Russian side. And you also have not just land desire, but you have the massive resources in Russia. And I just wonder how long that will stay peaceful, that they exchange these resources, or how long it will be to where China does something different.
I spoke to a Russian guy at a conference. We went off and had a coffee, and he was saying it is well known within Russia, their long-term plan, their long-term problem, is the same as everyone else. They've got to avoid being absorbed by the Chinese. And in fact, the Nord 2 pipeline that got blown up and all the gas that was going into Europe, that actually benefits the Chinese, because now that Russian gas is given to the Chinese in some form. Right, so they're scooping up everything. Right, and the Russians understand this, but it's like the BRICS nations, like India and China don't like each other, but they're in an alliance. Why they're in an alliance? Because they're trying to get out from under the Anglo-petrodollar. It's, okay, which adversary deal with first? While we're dealing with adversary number 1, we're in an alliance. So Russia and China are in an alliance. To the point where the Russians know the Chinese are stealing their military technology, but then they let it happen, because the military technology in Chinese hands will mean there'll be an effective opposition to the United States. Once the United States, whatever happens there, is dealt with, and who's left, then the Russians and the Chinese will be looking at each other over the border, and yes, that's going to be a big, big problem. And I don't know what the Russians are going to do about that.
Yeah, when I look, my mind looks at things sometimes like a game of Risk. And Russia is basically in Europe, and the rest of it's empty, and China's full and just sitting there, and it just makes me wonder. And I've also even wondered who actually benefits. A lot of times, people talk about BlackRock or things like that benefit the most from, or the military-industrial complex benefits the most from the Ukraine-Russia war, but I can't help to think of China benefiting a lot too.
Okay, BlackRock benefits Vanguard, State Street. Okay, they're the big players. But that's in a system at the moment that is based on fiat currency and numbers and zeros on a screen and is fundamentally flawed like a house of cards. What's going to happen when that system goes belly up? Yes, BlackRock is rich. But what if that economic system becomes irrelevant? You know, what's their true wealth? Who's truly benefiting behind that? And that's the game here. And I think it's at that level. It's resources, it's energy, and it's control. And there are no good guys, and there are multiple adversaries out there. And the public, the poor voting public, have no idea any of this is happening.
Okay. Jean also has a question. Go ahead, Jean.
Ah, Jean.
Jean.
Hello, Jean. Bonjour.
Oh, you're muted, John. Or at least I can't hear you. Yeah, you're muted. You need to click on the little button at the bottom.
Parla.
There. Yeah, I can hear you now. Good. Oh, you muted yourself again. Okay, now we can hear you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Now I want to ask Simon about China and UK. In 1999, they signed a deal on Hong Kong, where it's supposed to be for 50 years, a one country, two system. But this deal was good with Deng, but with new Chinese leader Xi, it was broken down. Now is only one system, and I think it is the end of China growth. What UK is not complaining about the breaking of this agreement signed between two countries?
So this comes back to the idea that we think China is like us and will adhere to the law and adhere to agreements and has our same ethic and moral code. Many nation states, like how many times has the United States broken an agreement?
A lot.
And everyone's just had to just put up with it because they're the big bad United States. Right. The Chinese are the same. What I personally saw in my professional career when I was in the coal industry, like this is what, 10, 15 years ago now, but the Chinese will go so far as to violate a written agreement. You could have a full corporate offer. You could have a contract, supply of coal between a coal mine and a power station. If it suits the Chinese, they'll violate their agreement. And there's nothing you can do. You try going to China and actually taking a company to court because they breached a contract. Yeah, right. But that basic idea is applied to nation states and agreements. It just the Chinese decided, now we lied. What are you going to do? So what that means is it's the end of the reputation. Like, can people really trust China? Russia was trying to actually address its reputation problems before all the Ukraine mess. They were trying to actually establish the idea that they could be trusted and respected again. The Chinese don't care. They really don't care. That's my opinion, that is. That when they talk to you, they'll tell you something else.
Mm.
So.
Thanks.
All right. Roger, go ahead. You have to unmute.
G'day, Roger.
Okay. Roger, it's there's a button at the bottom, and if you move your mouse, it's a little microphone. Yeah, there.
There we go. Now you can hear me. I clicked
Yes.
somewhere else. Thank you, Andrii. Very quickly, everybody. We've had 2 hours or something, haven't we? Yeah. So very quickly. To Andrii, thanks very kindly for organising this. As always, fascinating stuff, and I really appreciated your stuff on geothermal. 1, 2. To Simon, thank you very kindly for very detailed, informative, interesting, largely correct. A few comments which I might make, but largely correct on the rest of it. Very good. The places I would wake everybody up to, please, is oil. Jean and I and Charlie Hall are just finishing, so it should be published soon, I hope, a really nice paper on the price of oil. I looked at your graph, Simon, but we have a much more fundamental, simpler, deeper explanation, which is all in the paper. So when it's out, Andrew, if it's okay with you, I'll forward to you, and then you can handle with other people. So because it is a much deeper explanation, it differs from people like Gail Zvorygin and so on. It's a more, and it's a simpler story, but really quite important. And what was the last one? Oh, yes, the last one. So first of all, finally, bonsoir to everybody, including Jean, my wonderful co-author. And the last one, Andrei, is I have written a nice document on how to stop war. We're talking about all the threats, how to stop war. If it should be interesting, I will forward to you, and then we can discuss at some future date how we all stop war. But to both you and Simon, really, really good presentations. Thank you kindly.
I'd be very interested in that paper.
Yes,
So-
yes. And then feel free to present it next time. I know Steve has something, and then, yeah, if you, Rogers, and Roger, Charles, and Jean want to do that, that would be great. All right, so our next question is George Bushkirk. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you, Andre. I'm not doing video today, gentlemen, not just because I'm having a cigarette, but I am remote, so my linkage I don't trust. I am Dan's assistant, basically, and I sit at the feet of all of you gentlemen, and thank you for your wisdom. So from a layman's point of view, and something Dan and I had discussed was Mackinder's heartland theory. And I know that goes back to the early 1900s, Dan being a nuclear subman. Mackinder's heartland theory had been kind of, with the navies and the new technology. But my layman brain says it's drawing back to whoever controls the island controls the world just based on resources here. And strategically, Russia with 144 million, Europe with 600 million, and no resources to grab. And then you have China at 1.4 billion there. So the lack of strategy behind Europe and Russia playing nice these days. And again, I'm 48. So I got to watch the wall fall as I was coming through high school and had great ideals for the future. But anyway, thank you all for your information. I appreciate I appreciate it greatly, and I will sit back and shut up now.
Okay. So just for those who are unaware, the Mackinder heartland theory is that who rules East Europe commands the heartland, and who rules the heartland commands the world island, and the world island is the world. And so that would be in reference to the current Russia, US, or you could say BRICS versus NATO in Ukraine. All right.
I understand that Xi Jinping's not at this year's BRICS meeting. He's not even coming in virtually.
Oh,
yeah, I put that link on that he's been unaccounted for a couple days. It's a YN news out of India.
We're getting a lot of data internally that about 7 generals revolted, and there's a jumbling of seats going on right now inside of China.
Inside of China. Oh, okay. There's some instability there. Okay.
Oh yeah. How much of it's real, don't know, but it's definitely happening, and that's the thing they're most terrified of. The cultural revolutions that happen every now and then.
I sent you guys a link of something called the China Show. It's on YouTube. These two white guys are married to Chinese wives. They do a show on information smuggled out of China. So you see all the things when the floods going on. The Chinese, the workers who haven't been paid, they burn their factories down. So they keep track of that. It's rather an eye-opening experience when you watch their show, and all the actual people actually recording things on their phones, and then these guys get it out of China so the rest of us can see what's going on there.
Dusty is next. You have a question?
Yeah, and to be honest, I haven't fully flushed out how exactly to ask this question, so bear with me. I see it kind of an issue, or there's two groups of people that seem to be in this discussion, and some that are really well versed in the economics and others that are well versed in the physical realities. And, you know, especially in regards to oil and the resources, physical reality bears itself at some point. It just becomes reality. If you have a well in your backyard, it's easy to get water. If you got to go a mile away to get water, it's harder, and that's going to start affecting your life. You're not going to have time to do other things. It's just the physical reality. And I feel like on the economic side, I know, like you guys were mentioning quantitative easing, the price of oil in the past, all these different things. But a lot of times I view economics, especially today, as a way to make physical reality invisible to people, or to cover things over, and nations are then able to kind of screw each other over or mess with things through economics in such extreme ways sometimes, such extreme ways to manipulate reality, that's where things get very murky. And I just wonder, is it better to look at physical reality of, you know, how much oil we have, or it's in Alaska and we can get it, or is it better to look at the economics? How do we kind of flush the two? And that's maybe a good question for Dan, or for, I think, did we lose?
Do both. Run two parallel systems, right? Have each question, whether it's physical or economic, as a standalone analysis, but have the ability to go between the two. And because as people sort of go along, different strategies will interact with different parts.
Right.
Of the
Right.
Yeah.
And how do we tell? How can we tell if it's just, to be frank, a little bit of fudgery going on the numbers, especially on the economic side?
You asked a good question, Dusty, and I'll try to explain this. I'll try to explain this. So something happened in 2019 at a place called the BIS, the Bank for International Settlement. So before 2019, we had all these governments, and essentially called fiat currencies, paper currencies that these governments print. And understand, whether you've got a company, you have to live by the economic rules of currency. But those rules don't apply for governments. Governments can print debt, print money, they can violate the rules. Well, what happened is, after the 2008 financial crisis, 134 central banks, countries essentially got together at the BIS, and they said, we're enough of this crap. And what they did is they took gold and elevated it from a tier 3 asset to tier 1 asset that's equal to dollars, equal to the dollar. The difference is gold has no counterparty risk. So if you have gold physically in your control, in your central bank, it has no counterparty risk, and that is an asset that you can base your economic system on. So what's happened since then, since 2019, all these countries, like for example, in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, they send us oil, we pay for $1. Instead of taking those dollars and buying bonds, what they're doing is they're taking their dollars and buying gold. So what's happened now that our government, the United States government here in the United States, we're having a hard time, our government's having a hard time selling its debt. And that's not just the U.S. government. It's Japan's governments, the Europeans, the Canadians. They're all having problems because the game essentially changed in 2019. They turned gold legally back into money is what happened. So I understand what you're saying. Everything was floating all over the place, but now the entire world is actually focused on gold. This whole BRICS thing that's going on, these guys are focusing their economics on gold. That's how they're evaluating what things are worth between countries. You really don't understand this until you look at what's the price of gold, an ounce of gold in yen, or an ounce of gold in Canadian dollars, or an ounce of gold in dollars. Then you'll get it.
Okay, yeah, and then just as a response to that, I would like to add in a curveball that I think that we actually have enough minerals and the economies can function quite well to meet everybody's needs. But what to look for, though, it's harder to track, is kind of fear versus love. And like the more fear and greed we have, the more things break, because people are squeezing too hard. And whereas we have more love, and then there's more sharing, and then things work more smoothly. And so that's kind of the main dichotomy that I see in terms of what kind of future.
You're absolutely right, Andrew. One of my bigger problems, especially some of the guys at the Federal Reserve, they have these economic models and try to model our economy. I look at it, I'm sorry, it's all chaos. It's chaotic numbers. There's no way to model this thing because we're all fighting for the same resources. There are 8 billion of us on this planet fighting for resources, for jobs, food, water, you name it. How is it going to play out? I don't know.
Yeah, and we have enough resources if we were willing to be kind to each other and share them. Because we have enough land. That's the main one. All right. So the next one is Iver.
I was just going to ask about this. One little thing is, the DXY, which is the dollar index. It hit a 50-year low just the other day.
It's already fallen 10% this year. And the reason why all these countries are taking their dollars and they're buying gold, they're not buying our bonds.
Do you think that's what it is, or do you think? I mean, the U.S. dollar is going.
I can explain this to you. What it is, it has to do with you can either support your currency or support the bond market. Right now, the DXY, the value of the dollar relative to all those other currencies, what that's telling us is that the interest rates in the United States are too low, right? So if the Federal Reserve would raise interest rates on those bonds, the dollar would go up in value because all the money would rush into the dollar to buy those bonds. So what the market's saying is your interest rates are too low. That's what's going on.
Yeah, but if they raise those interest rates, then we have to pay more.
Kills the economy. I mean, housing's already in the toilet. Yeah, I know.
Plus, don't we
the
have
Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve's between a rock and a hard place. They're on a razor's edge. They can't go one way or the other.
And I know some countries are trying to get their gold reserves back from the U.S.
Yes, they are. Yep.
So next is Charlie. You have to unmute Charlie. You have to unmute Charlie. We can't hear you. It's on the screen, the little button. It looks like a little microphone.
Have I missed 3 hours of this meeting?
Yes, you have.
You didn't send the time, so I was.
Oh, I did.
You said same time as usual, and I didn't think to go look. So anyway, I'd like to know what I missed, but never mind that. I just like to point out when the Spaniards brought all the gold from the New World back to the Old World, they doubled its quantity and halved its value. It was no different from printing money, running the printing presses.
Exactly.
And so I think, of course, that the value of a dollar is the energy behind it, 5 megajoules per dollar, depending on inflation, et cetera. And so that the value of a dollar is the amount of work you can get for it. And that translates into all the goods and services that you can get. So pay to the bearer. I wish I had a dollar bill here. Pay to the bearer 5 megajoules is what it should be.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually made a wooden coin based on your idea. I just don't have it on me right now.
I was thinking, Andrew, I think it was in Europe back in the 15th century. They used to have merchants would trade these sticks with notches in them. That's what they used for money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I made a wooden coin, and it was like redeemed for a kilo of buckwheat.
Good. It goes back to good faith and trust. If the world doesn't believe in the United States, the value of the dollar falls. I mean, it's just paper. That's a bank.
Is what we did. Thank you. Is what we did before. Was it videotaped?
Yes. I'll send you the link.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry to miss it.
Okay, so Dusty and Roger.
Yeah, Dan, I have. Thank you for the explanation too, and I have heard a lot of talk about gold. I personally lean more towards Charlie's thinking of having an energy.
But Dusty, it's not my opinion. The banker no settlements changed the rules for all the banks in the world.
Correct. Yeah, and that part I agree with. I'm talking about a deeper. Kind of a deep, more fundamental philosophical premise, and I think, having an energy reserve, quote unquote, like Charlie was describing, it is probably more intelligent. Now, the second question I have is, you were talking before, I didn't hear this part about the oil in Alaska.
Yeah.
And in general, I think there's just there's other levers, even if you're on a gold standard or whatever. I think there's a lot of other levers for countries to have weird stuff go on economically to try to, again, hide physical reality. And that's kind of fundamentally my question is.
Desi, I agree with that. I think it was a couple days ago. There was an article out. It had to do with the USGS claiming basically all these undiscovered barrels of oil in the country. And I pull up a map and I said, they're saying there's 1.29 billion barrels of oil in the state of Nevada. And I pull up the geological map. I said, well, where the hell is the shell base in the state of Nevada? And I got drill cores all over the state of Nevada because they've been looking for gold and copper. There's some big world-class copper mines and gold mines in the state of Nevada. That state has been drilled from north to south, right? There's no shale in Nevada. Without that shale, that's what source the hydrocarbons to make oil. So how can they make this statement that there's 1.29 billion barrels of oil in the state of Nevada when there's no shale in that entire state? And you're absolutely right. They're sitting right in front of us trying to pump propaganda. And the problem is you run across people that actually have data, stats, maps, geology. You run into Simon and say, wait a minute here, time out here. You're pumping out a lot of BS here. That isn't going to work. Yeah. I agree with you. Yeah.
And that's my concern is there's so much smoke and mirrors going on and so much of that. And it's more like I'm trying to understand for my preparation in my mind. Let's say the reality is all the oil, let's just hypothetically, we have no oil left in the U.S. There's only some up in Alaska. I want to know what the projected physical reality of that looks like.
I understand exactly what you're saying, but there are powers that be that there's a lot of reasons why they don't want that coming out of the public. It's just like we have a mountain of data about Saudi Arabia that the government is basically lying through their teeth about the reserves, and you go back and say, okay, they said they had this many billions of barrels of reserve for like 30 some odd years. Obviously that can't be, because you're draining it like a tank. How I can tell you is, like, for example, and I'm going to say this because where I live here, I'm in the middle of government contractor land. The military industrial complex is what you all talk about. What we soldiers want to do is get the hell out of the Middle East. We would rather go to some kind of fuel so you don't have to put gasoline in your car. Put something else in there. Something I can make in your backyard. You can go down and actually touch it. Why are you messing with shipping stuff from one side of the planet to the other? It's causing all those wars. A lot of my friends are crippled because of the wars in the Middle East. If the oil wasn't there, nobody would go to the sandbox. Nobody would ever go to Saudi Arabia because that's all they got is sand and oil. If they had no oil, we wouldn't be they're killing ourselves. And so when I talk about the hydro thing, I'm looking up something that's practical we can do now, and we can get the hell out of everybody else's politics. I mean, a lot of what America does is because of that oil thing, that gasoline thing, pump thing, and that's what drives these presidents to do stupid crap.
Roger, you got to unmute. You got it.
Yeah, just to say, sorry to be boring, folks, but just to say, the paper that is just coming out from Charlie Hall, Jean Herrera, myself, and two others will answer an awful lot of those questions. Dusty Green, your bit about, it's all unclear and vague. It's not true at all. The data is quite clear and quite strong. You have to get access to it. We had the talk before about the $1 million data sets, and we've written some stuff about it. So Sean, Charlie, we've all had access to the $1 million data sets. It's all quite straightforward. It's all quite easy, and the numbers are quite clear. It's in the paper. It'll be out soon. And just
Roger,
Charlie, you look at the video. Yes,
Roger, you're absolutely right. But what I just talked about, something that happened here recently, a couple of days ago, is the United States Geological Survey came up with some paper claiming that billions of barrels of oil exist in the United States. And I gave an example, the state of Nevada, which has no shale basins. How can there be 1.29 billion barrels of oil there? So that's a clear example. I've got a government agency lying to the public, not purposely doing it. And they're doing it to help the guy that's in the White House right now. It's a clear lie.
Can I interrupt? Can I interrupt?
Go ahead.
I've looked at this. I've looked at the USGS numbers. I agree with most of them. You say there's no shale. What about other sedimentary basins in your state rather than just shale? I've
got the data. It's just not there.
State and that
it's
particular
just not there.
Data, but no shale. Why shale? Why not other sedimentary basins, other rocks?
That the other side, you're talking about like sandstone and so
sure.
forth. It doesn't exist. They're saying undiscovered oil. It doesn't exist.
Undiscovered.
Yeah, undiscovered.
I'd have to look.
It's propaganda. It's the fifth generation warfare, Simon.
That's what
Michaux
I'm getting
talking.
at. You go out there, I've got core samples going down 8,000 feet. There isn't any sign there's any oil in that state because these guys are out there looking for copper and gold, uranium.
I would have to look at your. I'd have to look at your data and
It's not mine. I mean,
USGS,
the
but
USGS.
Most of the data I look of USGS is largely correct. Pardon?
Yeah, this is recent.
I don't like. Andrew, I'm just telling them there's a good paper coming out with lots of good, solid
great.
data from
That's
the
wonderful.
$1 million data
And
sets.
we'll
and you need to
we'll
see it.
have you guys on next month to present it for sure. Charlie,
Very good.
you
Thanks
have
for
to
listening.
Charlie.
Do you have a way I can show my screen?
Yes, you have to. It's the third icon on the bottom where you unmuted.
Third icon?
Yeah. So there was the unmute, then there's a little video camera, and
Yeah.
then there's the share screen.
But it doesn't show my screen. Can you see that?
No, you have to select the window and then click OK.
Click OK.
Well,
Where do I click OK?
When you click the share screen icon, there'll be a little pop-up window that lets you select which window you want to share. You have to select the window you want to share and then click OK. Okay. Oh, okay. There we
Can
go.
you see
Yes.
this?
Yes. This is where oil and gas wells have been drilled to date.
Yeah, I don't know. Seems like any place where there's a hint of oil, they drill the hell out of. And I don't even know the source of this. I wish anybody know the source of this. I'd like to have it. But anyway, we've drilled a lot. And I'm kind of interested that the U.S. was a vast inland sea 100 million years ago. And that's where most of the oil came from, the bottom of that ocean.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think that shale hasn't been discovered or in any particular quantities in other parts of the world. So
Because it wasn't
now
an ocean.
what that is, by the way, now I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to give a talk on energy and agriculture next Wednesday. Is anybody interested in that? Send me an email and I'll send you a link. chall@esf.edu for the Canadian Club of Rome.
Oh, nice. Mm-hmm. Cool.
And it's a sort of ecological perspective on agriculture.
All right. So it looks like we're out of questions. Any final remarks, Simon?
Yeah. So what I presented tonight is the first time I've presented that. It's an analysis. I just happened to start from another direction. I found something, I suppose, by accident. It will evolve over time, and it will be extended to other countries. If what I've found is correct, then we have been in a state of war with a country that actually controls our own industrialization for some time now. So if that's true, that does lead to what we have to do going forward. But I see everything as a system. So we've got multiple problems on the books, right? And we really have to sort of take control. What I'm just saying is the analysis I showed tonight is something that will evolve over time.
Who's we are at war? We.
Okay,
Finland?
Charlie, you didn't see. I made the presentation on the industrial footprint of China.
Okay.
Now, what's China?
I'll watch it. Never mind.
Yeah. And as to who's we, China sees the United States as their explicit enemy, and they see control of the industrialization network as the metric for success.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
it's a big picture that stitches together a lot of the things that we've been seeing for the last couple of decades.
Right. And so I just wanted to round up my presentation as well, and that basically if we manage to maintain enough love and kindness and compassion for each other across all these nations and get to the 2030s in a peaceful way, then we can have a peaceful transition into global geothermal, global deep geothermal, as it says here, like 2035, 50 to 60% should have access. And while it won't be nearly as much energy as we're getting right now from oil, but if we distribute the land, and then we'll still be able to keep the lights on and have some industrial manufacturing going, and even some hydrogen for export for transportation and things like that. So there is a bright future ahead. Yeah, but everyone who's praying and loving and being kind to one another and to themselves, you're doing a great job, and continue doing that. Okay, so I guess, is that all for final remarks then? And so as we found you, we'll leave you in the love and in the light of the infinite creator within you and all around you. Go forth, therefore, rejoicing in the infinite power and the infinite peace of the creator, my friends. Adonai. Okay. All right.
Hey, John.
Mhm.